Mike, if you will, go back there, and there's some printouts that look like this. Paul was talking Wednesday night about the encampment. And so if you'll make sure everybody's got one of those. He was telling about how the Israelites, when they travel, the first thing would happen would be the tabernacle would be put in place and then set up, and all the required things in place, and then the tribes would assemble around the tabernacle itself. They were assigned places, and so they would line up at the same place every time. So it's very orderly, very succinct in how they travel and how they assemble. And so you could imagine a couple of million people. You don't just say, hey, let's go. It's time to move. You've got to have a system to it. And so they were given that system. And you remember, as Paul pointed out Wednesday night, that they were guided by a cloud above them during the day and then a cloud of fire at night. And so they knew where they were going because God guided them. And when the cloud stopped or the light stopped, that's when they stopped. And when they stopped, then these priests were carrying this tabernacle on their shoulders, and they'd stop and set everything up and be prepared for God's presence to be there. That's helps you picture that. Thank you, Mike. I've got one here. So anyway, I think we ended up Wednesday night getting to the book of Judges. They had gone into the promised land, and if you read through the whole thing, it's an inspiring situation. Like most of us, what God intended to be celebratory and peaceful and systematic became somewhat interrupted because you remember Achan sinned by taking the Babylonian garment. They were told to not take any of the spoils from the city of Jericho. That was to be dedicated to the Lord. All the riches that they received was to be dedicated to the Lord. And Achan took some of that and hid it in his tent. And so they lost the next battle. A lot of things there. We won't go back. Paul's already covered that book. But just little things to file away is subtle things. And we can learn lessons. Romans chapter 15, verse 4 said, these things are written aforetime were written for our learning, that we, through patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. Little subtle things, subtle maybe to us, obviously more subtle to them at the time, but God had blessed them. And they'd been very successful at Jericho, did exactly what God told them to do. The walls fell outward, not inward. And so pretty obvious that this was a victory God gave them. And they were supposed to acknowledge that by leaving all the spoils for God. But they went to the next battle without God's direction. God didn't say, okay, now you go to Ai. Now keep in mind, they'd been guided by the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. And now they're in the promised land, and they're kind of making some decisions on their own. But they were defeated at Ai. And in that defeat, kind of humiliated. They didn't understand. They said, we don't need everybody to go up. Now, God didn't say you don't need everybody to go up. They said, we don't need everybody to go up to Ai. We can take this. And they gave the number of men they could take it with. And Joshua let them go on. And Joshua didn't know there was sin in the camp. He didn't know Achan had taken the Babylonian garment and the gold and the silver. He didn't know that. So they were humiliated. 36 of them died. And so no reason for that to have happened had they consulted with God. If you just read that and not paying real close attention, immediately you think, well, why didn't God tell them? Why didn't God say, no, don't go up? Why didn't God say there's sin in the camp? Because he eventually will. When they're defeated, he says, there's sin in the camp. Joshua's response was, where are you, Lord? You brought us all the way out here. Now we're in the promised land, and you let us be defeated before our enemies. We're going to be humiliated. They're going to say, you don't take care of your people. And God was kind of abrupt with Joshua. He, in essence, says, stop your crying and get up. What are you crying for? There's sin in the camp. And again, we could blame God and say, why didn't he tell them ahead of time? Why didn't they ask ahead of time? God was so meticulous about what he told them to do in Jericho, that you'd think they would at least consulted God and said, is it okay to go up? Is this the city you ought to go up to next? Is there a particular order we need to follow to go up to face this city? I mean, God made them stay there 7 days and march around that city. Once a day, every day for 6 days, and then 7 times on the 7th day. You would think that they'd say, okay, we did everything you told us to do. It turned out the way you told us it'd turn out. What must we do next? A little humorous story to maybe application here. When I was in high school, I worked at a nursing home as an orderly after school. And so I'd work from 3 to 11. So I have to help, put the patients to bed at night. And this one little lady, every night, you say, okay, it's time to go to bed. She liked to visit. And so she'd go down and come back and say, what must I do next? And so you'd have to tell her every step to take, Well, go get your bedclothes on, and every step. Then she'd come back after she'd done that and said, what must I do next? At least looking back on it, we have the advantage of being able to look back on these things. But looking back, I would say, I would ask God every step. Since he was so detailed in that first battle, I'd say, what must I do next? What do you want me to do next? Which city is next? How should we approach that city? He'll eventually tell them how to do it. He'll tell them, look, they think they've defeated you. Now you go up and like you're taking city, and you turn around like you're running like you ran the first time. And they'll come out, and you'll come in from the other side. Don't want to go into Joshua too much, but some of those things are a little bit, get lost when you're just reading through it. But what didn't they ask? Maybe I should ask myself that question. When I know what God wants me to do, and I know how God blesses me, why would I get ahead of God and just assume some things in my life rather than making sure I consult God's Word to say, is this what I ought to be doing? Is this the way He would want me to live and the things He'd want me to do? Or if I've got to have interaction with somebody, that I'd pray to God first and say, please help me handle this correctly. Make sure I'm right in my dialogue with this person and my approach to this person. Sometimes we've done it before and we just assume you do it the same way. And it might not be the same way. Maybe something in that person's life or something in my life that I need to correct. Kind of like Matthew chapter 5. If you come and you recognize your brother has aught against you, leave your gift. Go be reconciled to your brother and then come. So there's some application for us that we can just do things because we've always done them and assume that now we've grown spiritually. We don't need that kind of consultation from God. We don't need to study as much. We don't need to communicate with each other as much. We just kind of do what's next or what we think is next rather than saying, look, it works. When we do what you tell us to do and the way you told us to do it, it works. And so we want to make sure we consult thy word every time we have to handle something in this life. So when you get to the book of Judges, it picks up where Joshua leaves off. In Joshua 24, Joshua has divided all the land with the people. By this time, Joshua's an old man. He's seen a lot. He's experienced a lot. And, you kind of read that and he wants to go home. He wants to go home to his own property. He wants to be with his own family. And he wants them to stay busy doing what God told him to do. You finish driving these people out. And he kind of tells each tribe, there's still people among you, not supposed to be among you. You drive them out. You make sure you go to God. You'll see that in Judges chapter 1. They'll go up and ask God, when should we go up? How should we do this? And so Joshua 24 reminds them of God's blessings and gives them some examples of how God had delivered them from their enemies and how the land's been divided. And he will say, of all things God promised you, he's fully kept that promise. All the land that he promised them is yours. And so when sometimes people today religiously say, well, God's still going to fulfill with the promise to Israel, and that land over there is going to be restored to Israel, and it's just not true. Joshua said, it's all been done. Everything that God promised you, he kept. You have it. Now, they lost it because the other part of that promise was, as long as you're obedient to me, you're going to stay in the land, and I'm going to bless you. But if you're disobedient to me, I'm going to drive you out of this land with the people that you failed to drive out. That's what I'm going to do. And so they experienced all that. So it's a very positive, climactic kind of thing in Joshua chapter 24. Now he places it in their hand. He wasn't a king, he was a leader like Moses was. He wasn't even a judge. He was a leader, mostly a military leader. But when the battles were fought, the enemies were subdued, they could handle their own portion and their own enemies like they should. Then he said, I placed before this day. He placed again those things that God had rehearsed with them, the laws and the commandments. And he said, choose you this day whom you will serve. Either the gods of your fathers, which were beyond the flood. He's talking about Abraham and the idolatrous ancestors that he had in the Ur of the Chaldees. You can choose those. Or you could choose these gods of the land in which you dwell. The God of the Amorites, in whose land you dwell. Little subtle thing, another one of those little things. Why are they still in the land? They hadn't finished driving them out. So if you haven't finished driving them out, guess what? They're still here, and they're still practicing their religion and worshiping their God. You can choose that. But then Joshua said, as for me and my house, we will serve Jehovah. So that's a pretty stark promise, isn't it? Sometimes we read that and say, since the man is the head of the house, and he doesn't consult anybody else, and there's nobody else involved, and he just says this is the way it's going to be. Well, ultimately, somebody got to make that decision, and Joshua was confident that his family would follow him in that decision because he'd lived that way before his family. All the way back to the passage in Numbers 13 and 14, when they sent out the spies. He came back, he and Caleb, and they reported the land just like God promised. He said, let's go up at once. These people will be bread to us. And so they were in that environment that whole time. And they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and Joshua was one of those people that never lost his vision of what he saw in the land of promise, never lost his confidence in God, and so his family got to witness that. So there wasn't any question in his mind. This is who we are. They stayed with him that whole time, and they evidently shared his faith that whole time. So he could say with great confidence, for me and my house, we're going to serve Jehovah. He wasn't saying that as a tyrant, that I'll make sure they stay in line. He's saying, that's who we are. In that context, in order to make sure we get the right thrust when we get to the book of Judges, in that context of chapter 24, the people said, we'll serve Jehovah. Again, sometimes in our conversation when we're all together, it sounds pretty easy to do that, doesn't it? He said, no, you won't. He told them they're going to turn from the Lord, and they said, oh, yes, we will. We choose Jehovah. We're going to serve Jehovah. He said, no, you won't. And so he raised their attentiveness to say, what in the world is he saying no, we won't for? Oh, yes, we will. And so he required them to take an oath. And he said, the laws are written on this stone, these stones. They're going to be your witnesses. That you committed this day, that you choose Jehovah, and you're going to serve him. So it wouldn't just say, well, I know you will, or, okay, now this is serious business. He caused them to understand that they were in the presence of God, and they were saying that not just to Joshua, but they were saying that to God and to each other. Now here are these stones that were erected with that law on it that would echo from then on. This is the promise we made, to keep this covenant that we have with God. And to their credit, before Joshua 24 ends, it said they were faithful. They kept their oath. They kept their promise. They kept that covenant. All the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua. And so they meant it, and they did it. So when you get to Judges, it said, now, after the death of Joshua came to pass, the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, who shall go up against the Canaanites and first fight? So different enemies are still in the land that are in different geographical locations. And so they're doing the right thing. Maybe they learned from Jericho, but they're saying, who should go up? In this particular case, he says that Judah's going to go up, and Simeon goes up with him. In verse 3, Judah asked Simeon to go up. Paul mentioned Wednesday night, I think, and just passing, that wasn't his point, but he's talking about after a period of time, some of those tribes kind of got absorbed in other tribes, you know. Simeon is one of those. They don't stand out by themselves, but they seem to always be with Judah. And geographically, they connect. And so Judah asked Simeon, will you go up with me? And he said, yeah. So they share a geographical location, and so that means they share an enemy. And they go up and fight together. And each one of these is broke down, not our point to go through each of those tribes and who they were fighting and having to go up to do that. But each time it says, but they didn't utterly destroy them. They didn't completely drive them out. They were successful in their battles. They subdued their enemies, but they didn't remove them. And that's a repeated context of chapter 1. What we often do is when we look at the book of Judges, you know, there's a purpose that's called judges. These are deliverers. These are individuals that are called upon in a particular history of Israelite people to fight all specific enemies. And each of those judges have a specific cause. There's a specific need. And so when you look at that, the first one will be Othniel. Really hard not to spend some time on that, but we don't have the time to spend on it. But Othniel was a son-in-law to Caleb. Remember when the land was divided, Caleb said, give me the land where the giants dwell. And so he was given that land. And then he said, anybody will go up and conquer the city of the giants, I'll give my daughter to him in marriage. And I'll give him property. And so Othniel was the one that went up and fought and was successful. So he will become that first judge. And you see that in verse 12 of chapter 1, that Othniel was that first one. And so once they got everything settled and fought these battles, then he was that first judge. When you get to chapter 2, there's a little context before we get into the judges themselves. But when you get to chapter 2 and you look at verse 6, it connects us what we've spent some time talking about with Joshua 24. It said, when Joshua had let the people go, the children of Israel went every man to his own inheritance to possess the land. And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, who had seen the great works of the Lord that he did for Israel. Now that's back in Joshua 24 and 31. Very same acknowledgement that they were faithful while Joshua was alive and while those men who outlived Joshua, those elders of Israel, they were faithful. These were the ones, it said, who saw the great works of God. We spent a lot of time, when I say we, I'm talking about Christians in general. Not necessarily we at Pine Street, though we do some of that. We talk a lot about how it used to be. And there's some really, really impactful preachers in my life. You know, that we used to say things like, man, they can preach the bark off the tree. You know, they can preach the paint off the wall. It's like these people have ability to really take God's word and get your attention and hold it and say, man, I need to get busy serving the Lord. Boy, I'm not right with the Lord. I need to get right with the Lord. And we look at those, and it's real easy for us to say how it used to be. You see, the way Israel was faithful, Joshua and the elders that outlived him were faithful. And part of the reason they were faithful is They were reminded of great works that God had done. They remembered all the battles. They remembered all of His blessings. They remembered His punishment when they were disobedient. They remembered. And it says that's why they were faithful here, because they saw the great works of the Lord. Now, you and I might not see the same things that our forefathers saw in the development of this nation or society, or particularly when you're talking about spiritual influence. But we're supposed to emulate it. We're supposed to say, okay, that's faithful. That's what we're supposed to do. And they saw the great works of God, and they told us about the great works of God. And so we need to be busy about being God's people and telling people about the great works of God. And sometimes we think there was just one generation that had that kind of fire, had that kind of knowledge and had that kind of fervor. Shouldn't be. Should be passed on to say, here's what God did. I saw it. I witnessed it. Here's what God did. Now you need to know that that same God takes care of you. And so Joshua then, having served the Lord, it said, was 110 years old, and he was buried in the borders of his inheritance in Timnath Heres and the mount of Ephraim on the north side of the hill of Gaash. And also all that generation were gathered to their fathers. And there arose a generation, this is the key, this is what describes, in a general sense, this is what describes the book of Judges. And there arose a generation after them that knew not the Lord, nor the great works which He had done to Israel, for Israel. Notice the contrast. Joshua was faithful. The generation, the elders that outlived Joshua were faithful. And then there arose a generation that weren't faithful. Why? They knew not the Lord, nor the great things He'd done. Mm.
How if you don't teach them and push them to live according to the law of God, then they come along and
Right.
it's serious.
All right. And I think you see some of that with Brother Oliver pointing out, didn't teach their children. I think there are two possibilities in Judges chapter 2. Two possibilities. To have a generation that doesn't know Jehovah. Either what Brother Oliver just said is true, is a generation stopped teaching, so nobody knew. Or a generation stopped listening. And the reason I think those are two options is Oliver and I grew up at the same time. And early on, we were both here in this congregation. And we can look around us, and there's a whole lot of people our age who are not here this morning. Not because they don't live in Crossett or Hamburg or the surrounding area. Now, we both heard the same thing. We were both taught the same truth. We both sat at the feet of godly preachers, and we had elders, and some of those elders were family members, and so we were taught those things. But we were in the Bible class with others who were taught the same thing. My question would be, where are they? It wasn't because they weren't taught. I'm talking about ours. I can't say this about what's taking place in Judges, but I think those are the only two options. Either somebody quit teaching or somebody stopped listening. And either way, you're not going to know about the great works of the Lord. And sometimes with preachers, you start telling stories and you start relating things rather than teaching God's Word. And if you stop teaching God's Word, they're not going to know God. Be the way. Okay, I think so.
We stopped teaching, but there arose a generation that Pharaoh didn't know about Joseph. And
Yeah.
he turned on them, but we have doors in the community. Well, it don't work. Well, that's not our job,
Right.
it has to work. Our job is to go knock on the door.
That's right.
And so as long as we do that, well, then we're doing our part, but they won't listen, that's their part.
That's right.
They'll give an account of that, so it's a two-sided street there.
It is.
Doing that.
I think it is. And so we have to look at this. The bottom line is there arose a generation that didn't know Jehovah. Now, everything we're going to read about in Judges that's chaotic and destructive and godless, and there'll be a common theme throughout the whole book of Judges is that there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Now, if you know Jehovah and the great things he's done, what do you know about Jehovah? Got to do his works. Got to be obedient to his will. You remember the stones that we talked about in Joshua 24? He writes the covenant, the laws of God on these stones. He said, these stones are going to be your witnesses, that you committed to do what's written on these stones. See, that's the important part. In a New Testament context, don't want to preach you a sermon here, but to make application to us, in 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul's at the end of his ministry. He's an older man now, and he knows he doesn't have long to live, and he's kind of mentored some of these young preachers like Timothy and Titus. But he says to Timothy, in the second letter they wrote to him, I charge thee therefore before God and before the Lord Jesus Christ. Kind of like Joshua did. He called their attention. They said, oh yeah, we'll keep the covenant of Jehovah. He said, no you won't. And when they really got focused on, this is God's covenant, this is God's will, and we'll serve Jehovah, when he really got their attention, he said, all right, now in the presence of that God, there's going to be a witness that you know what you're committing to, this covenant of God. And so Paul said to Timothy, I charge thee therefore before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who shall judge the quick and the dead at his appearing in his kingdom. Now listen, preach the word. Be instant in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort, with all long-suffering and doctrine. That's teaching. You keep teaching. You keep teaching. And you do it in the presence of God, realizing these are the truths of God that people have to hear. Now he said, again, a New Testament illustration, there's going to come a time when they will not endure sound doctrine. And what was Timothy's charge? You preach it. You teach it. And as Billy Wayne pointed out, they may choose not to listen. There's going to be those that decide to harden their hearts and stop their ears and not hear it. But you preach it anyway. That way, as Billy Wayne said, you do your part. It's like, well, that doesn't work anymore. You just do your part. If they choose to reject it, then that'll be on them. But if we say they're not going to hear it anymore and we don't try to share it anymore, then Oliver's first comment is true. We stop teaching. So they don't want to hear. We tell it whether they want to hear it or not. And that's what Timothy was told. Yes, sir.
Another thing you see, when people become rich and have, not just rich, but they have the things, they don't have to work for it, they don't have to fight for it, they don't see the hand of God right there.
That's right.
They become distant and foreign in their knowledge of God. They forget who God is.
That's exactly right. And that's always a danger, when we become prosperous. Now, remember, Joshua, the book of Joshua covered them going in and conquering the land and it being divided. Now they're prospering. Now they own land that already have places built on them, already have crops planted. They own the land. And instead of driving the enemy out, they were prosperous. And so they thought, okay, we've got them subdued and they'll do anything we ask them to do. So we'll let them cut our wood and draw our water for us. Man, life is good. Not only we own the land, but we don't have to do the work. We've got servants to do the work. And then on that stone that was a witness, like, no, you don't make any agreements or leagues with the people of land. You destroy them. And oh yeah, we'll serve Jehovah. No, you're more concerned with who's going to serve you and your prosperity. That's always a danger, isn't it?
Another thing,
That's exactly right. And then they start serving those gods. What was the choice given? You can serve the God of our fathers which was beyond the flood, or you can serve the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. If me and my house will serve Jehovah. Well, they're not in Ur of Chaldees, so not as much danger to serve the God that Abraham's father served. But the Amorites, if you don't drive them out, they're still going to be practicing their religion. You talk about denominational world today, they had their own religions. And eventually, the reason they'll be taken into captivity is they began to worship those same gods. But if they knew who Jehovah was and the great works we'd done, that'd be no temptation. That's why it wasn't a temptation to Joshua. He said, for me and my house, we're going to serve Jehovah. We've seen Jehovah and his work and his blessings. We've seen Jehovah defeat our enemies. We've seen Jehovah part the Red Sea. We've seen Jehovah allow all of us to walk across on dry land. We've seen Jehovah allow those waters to collapse on the Egyptians. We've seen the great works of the Lord. Now, it wasn't my intention to get too far in that, because I want to mention the Judges to you so you can kind of see how the book is laid out. And you can go back and drill down and look at some of these context. But every judge is fighting some enemy, and there was supposed to be no enemies left in the land. And that's the key. To get that part, you can say, wow, we're fighting this battle because they didn't finish the battle to start with. Even after you read Judges chapter 1, he said, go up, defeat them. They went up and subdued them, but they didn't defeat them. They didn't drive them all out. And so with that, the works of the Lord, they forgot who he was.
That's one reason why God continuously, from the start of mankind until now, has always put those stipulations for us to go back, and those things for us to remember. The Passover, each time those blessings come with responsibility, that's when it's the hardest to be a Christian or to be faithful to God, is when everything's going good and you lose that reliance on God. When you're down in the dumps, it's easy to get your knees in.
Oh, God, help me. Yep.
But
Yep.
when things are good, it's, oh, look what I've done. Or I'm going to build some bigger barns. And good. Constantly God's telling us, I want you to do this so to remind you of who I am. And keep
Yep.
me number one in your life. And that's going to be the hardest part. Well, it's still for us today.
I think so. Yeah, I'd have to say it is for me. When things are going real well, two things happen with me. Is when things are going real well, I'm still grateful. But I'm not as expressive of my gratitude to God, because things are going well. I'm just doing the next thing. It's not that I'm in rebellion to God. It's not that I'm at odds with God. It's that I take God's blessings for granted. And so I don't remember the great works and why they were done, in the same sense that if I'm struggling with it, or there's been interruptions in it, or society is, making it difficult, then I say, God, help me address this right. And the other part is, you just be so overwhelmed by the circumstances that brought hardship in my life that that's what I think about. Man, this is hard. I wish this would get better. Rather than to say, look, my relationship with God shouldn't change. No matter the circumstance, it should be the same. And he's going to do great works through me no matter what the works are. I lose my health, I've got an opportunity to influence those who are providing care for me, that I'm confident in God. I can tell them about the great works that God has done in my life, that he's going to do for me in the next life. I can do that if I don't forget the great works he's done and the promise he's made. And so those are the two challenges in my life, that I'm blessed and I'm doing good things, but I'm not pausing saying, wow, what a God I serve who's blessed me with these things. How can I share these things? How can I bless others with these things? I'm not as conscious as I ought to be. And as Billy Wayne said, sometimes say, well, I invest a little bit over here, or I could build that bigger barn and it'd be better for me, rather than saying, what can I do with the blessings God's given me? That becomes a challenge to me. Let's read this, and then I'm going to mention the Judges quickly. In chapter 2 of the book of Judges, this is kind of the context that I think you can decide which one you think it is. It's either they stopped teaching or a generation stopped listening. And as Billy Wayne said, it could be both. Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges which delivered them. He's talking about, the earlier verses talked about the anger of the Lord was against them, and he delivered them into the hands of their spoilers. He was disappointed because they didn't drive out the people. And so he said, nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges which delivered them out of the hands of the spoilers, and that is those enemies. And yet they would not hearken unto their judges. Do you get that part? He raised up deliverers, and that's what judges mean. He raised up deliverers, but they wouldn't hearken unto their judges. For they went a-whoring after the other gods. What are there other gods in the land for? You got to think about, what are they there? Because you left the people there, people worshiping their gods, and now you're influenced by their gods. And bowed themselves unto them, and they turned quickly out of the way which their fathers walked in, obeying the commandments of the Lord, but they did not so. Do you get that? Their fathers obeyed them. These people turned out of the way. Can you turn out of a way that you're not in? Sounds like they might have been taught, and they chose not to follow it anymore. Now, it may have been the fathers not following anymore either, don't know. And when the Lord raised them up judges, then the Lord was with the judge and delivered them out of the hands of the enemies all the days of the judge. And it repented the Lord because of their groanings by reason of them that oppressed them. No, that's what happens to me. Things start going south on me. I got to have God's help, and so I get a little more tuned in. Lord, this is not good. I've been traveling without you, and I've been trying to figure this out myself, and please help me. And that's kind of where they were. It came to pass that when the judge was dead, they returned and corrupted themselves. Notice, turned. The judge was to instruct them in God's way and lead them out from their enemies, and they would have their prayer answered. They would cry to God. He'd deliver them, and then they'd turn back away from God. They ceased not from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way. And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he said, because that this people had transgressed my covenant. You've gone beyond what I've instructed you. You stopped short of what you're supposed to do. You transgressed my covenant. What was written on those stones? Covenant. They're your witnesses. You said you're going to serve Jehovah? This is how you serve Him. He's articulated how you serve Him. And they did that. All the days of Joshua and all the days of elders outlived Joshua. And he said, because that this people had transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and have hearkened not unto my voice. So they sound like they stopped listening, didn't it? And also will not henceforth drive out any before them of all the nations which Joshua left when he died. Joshua said, you still got enemies here, finish the job. And Judges opened up by saying, as they go to God and say, who should go up? And said, Judah, you going up first. Judah said, Simeon, will you go with me? They went up, they defeated their enemies, but they didn't drive them out. And here they are again. He said, through them I may prove Israel. He said he wasn't going to drive them out. He's going to use them to prove Israel. I mean what I say. I'm going to bless you when you obey me. And because you didn't obey me, I'm going to remind you by those people you didn't drive out, you didn't destroy. They're going to remind you you were disobedient, and I'm going to use them to remind you. That through them I may prove Israel, whether they will keep the way of the Lord, to walk therein, and their fathers did keep, as their fathers did keep it or not. You get to decide. Therefore the Lord left their nations without driving them out hastily, neither delivered them from the hand of Joshua. So, wasn't finished under Joshua. They didn't finish the work, and God left them there. And they're, in essence, to say when they're crying for deliverance, just get rid of them. You take care of it. He said, no, I told you to take care of it. I'm going to defeat them. I'm going to give you back your ability to defeat them. But I'm not doing it for you. Now, if you want to just jot these down, in Judges 3, you have Ehud. He's a left-handed dagger man. He has a sword, and they're under the Moabites. Again, some people they didn't drive out. And he goes in like he's taking a gift and kills the king of Moab. And then in chapter 4, you have Deborah, the woman judge. And that's the Canaanites. Remember, Judah went up to fight the Canaanites, but he didn't drive them out. And then chapter 6 through 8, you have that familiar story of Gideon, and had 32,000. God said too many, and kept giving him instructions of how to reduce that down. Got down to 300, and defeated the Midianites. The foolish judge, Jephthah, in Judges 11, that promised to offer God as a burnt offering whatever came out of his house first. The strong judge in Judges 13 through 16 was Samson. And so those are the ones that kind of stand out to it. There are 15 total. And so when you read through the book of Judges, different enemies came along, different judges was raised up, and they would have a period of time, usually a generation. Usually about anywhere from 20 to 40 years, they'd have peace. But then it would say, then every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Just don't seem to learn, do we? All that time, you should be saying, the only reason we're here is God blessed us and God placed us here and God defeated our enemy. We've got to stay focused on that. The witness for us is God's covenant. He tells us He's going to bless us if we're obedient. He's going to punish us if we're disobedient. We must be obedient because we love the Lord and we want to help each other have these blessings. We don't want to lose it. There was this cycle that every man would do that which is right in his own eyes. And when He said there's no king in Israel, now the first thing we noticed that the first king would be Saul that God would select, but He was saying more than that. He was saying, you're not letting God be your king. Because when He does select Saul, Samuel, He tells Samuel, look, Samuel, they haven't rejected you. They're wanting a king like the nations around them. They haven't rejected you. They rejected me from being king over them. And so God wasn't ruling in their lives. So that'll give you a little framework when you're reading through the book of Judges. Drill down in those different judges and see what's going on with them and what they would have left out from what the covenant said. All right, appreciate your comments.